Welcome to the Family Office Sherpa podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Parkin, founder and managing director of Whole Road Investments. The aim of this podcast is to provide practical and implementable advice for those looking to build, manage, or service a family office. This is not investment advice, however, so please check the disclaimer in the show notes. In this episode, we are covering the unique challenges of managing the embedded family office.
This is the Family Office Sherpa.
So, the embedded family office, what is it? Well, in my mind, there's three sort of main family office types, right? So you've got the single family office, which is, as the name suggests, one single family office, and sits away from operating businesses and things like that. It's set up as a standalone, almost standalone multi-asset class portfolio management business. You've got a multifamily office, which unfortunately has sort of been, the naming conventions have been taken over from a marketing point of view and it's being used more for sort of wealth management or commercial wealth management. But in my head, a multifamily office is an office that's set up similar to a single family office, which is for the single focus of managing the assets of a family, to setting up an office for multiple parts of the same family. So you do see multiple family offices with cousins and things like that, extended family, but ultimately still not a commercial arrangement. If you start to charge fees in terms of wealth management or asset management, then you're not a multifamily office, you're a wealth manager. There's nothing wrong with that, just call it what it is. But what we're talking about today is embedded. So when I say embedded, it's embedded inside the operating business. So you do see a lot of this, especially as a sort of pre-liquidity event, in that they are starting to get good cash flow from the private business. That cash flow is invested and is sort of set up as a separate entity within the operating business known as the family office or the investment portfolio or whatever it's called. You see it all the time. It's a real challenge because a lot of the time it is seen as away from the main concentration or the main target of the family at the time, which is the operating business, which makes a lot of sense. So you end up getting these smaller portfolios or these portfolios that are just when there's free cash flow or there's opportunities come up that they're put into this bucket called the family office, right? So it sits to do very clear, what we're talking about is that office that sits within the operating business, not as a standalone single family office. And so how are they categorized? What are they categorized by? So often, to be honest, a lack of strategy. There's very often no investment policy or some sort of strategic component here, which says the purpose of this investment is to outperform this or some form of benchmark, or the constituents need to look like this, the risk profile looks like this. There's often a lack of clarity around return expectations, the risk associated with them, usually because the operating business is by far the largest asset within the portfolio. If you broke it down by asset allocation, you'd have this massive component, which is the operating business, and then you'd have these small components. And that's kind of how it's looked, right? So I think if you looked at the portfolio of X, the operating business, it would be meaningful. But within the context of the operating business being the main asset, it can look like it's a hodgepodge of investments here and there, opportunities that arise. I'm not saying they're not good investments. I'm saying that sometimes there's just a lack of clarity around the purpose of those investments. There's definitely an oversight uncertainty. So whose role is it? Whose responsibility are these assets? Especially if they're managed internally, or you often see them managed by a disparate bunch of wealth managers, asset managers, consultants, and things like that. None with a real clear mandate, or not often with a clear mandate. So, and then also you've got this responsibility overlap between the staff within the operating business and those that sit within this other unit, this family office portion of it. And that often is the accounting, payments, those more operational componentry tends to have a significant amount of overlap. And those people working in the operating business, like, what is this? Why am I looking after an equity trade with this broker when I'm actually supposed to be doing this for this manufacturing component or this real estate business or whatever it ends up being. So you do get this overlap and uncertainty around roles and responsibilities. It ends up being a lot of the time given to those within sort of the finance department, because obviously that's where the cash flows occur, and they end up by proxy getting the responsibility, which is not always easy to manage. And so that does create these governance challenges. And obviously, Hall Road's business model is around governance, so this is a particular interest to me. And governance is really hard to manage when you've got no one that has a lot of the time there's no one person that has responsibility, or not one group has responsibility. So governance is, like especially around risk management, like I said, investment policy, things like that, having some strategic specificity around what's the purpose of this. And also the governance around cash flow management and, things like settlement of trades or, capital call management. There's all these sort of operational intricacies that, if left unchecked or untended, can be problematic. So hence why, this podcast is really around sort of highlighting, not to say that embedded offices shouldn't be there. It's just that they need to be treated the same way that you would treat the single family office. Give it the roles and responsibilities, give it the time, give it the governance structure. So with that in mind, what are some of the ways I've seen this type of office, this embedded office, improve? What are the steps we can take to improve the operational efficacy of that? One of the things that we see doing is bring it outside the operating business, create a clear demarcation between this is the operating business, this is the investment office or the family office. Call it by different names. We often see people change the name of it really specifically to make it very clear, okay, I work for this entity or I work for this entity. Just even creating that clear demarcation is sometimes really, really a good idea. And either begin a program of outsourcing if you're not going to resource it specifically, or, so either outsource or create a standalone unit staffed with someone or some people that have really specifically given that responsibility. You manage this, right? You are the point person. You are the person that all these, interactions with counterparties, managing the portfolio, any other family office services that sit within that, sits under that. Call it the CEO, call it the head of, call it whatever, but give someone that responsibility and that agency to make decisions on behalf of that part of it. The other thing that we're saying is a lot of the time they make a decision to build an investment committee or some other governance structure similar to that, which is, to be honest, this is where Hall Road is usually brought in. And so we can go through what that initial process looks like, right? So Hall Road, so I come in, there's an element of, right, well, what's the first priorities? What's the intention here? So a lot of the time there's an establishment of a charter or some purpose document that's not already there. If they do have one, often it's a review to make sure that it's in place, that it's fit for purpose, that it actually means something that we're following. There's also an investment policy that needs to be established as well, because investment policy, again, is a governance document that is specific to this investment office. And so what that will do is it'll provide clarity on the purpose, as well as, what the underlying constituents look like, what the risk profile, the return expectations, the benchmarks we're going to be using, how we're going to implement this, if there's an implementation program, and then ultimately how we're going to manage the assets, right? So that's a really, really important document to establish at the beginning. And then once that establishment is there, I mean, it's not like these sit in silos, but this obviously is a moving feast to a certain degree. It's like, what are we looking to do? The next one is often a review of current counterparties. Like who are, as I mentioned at the top of this, like a lot of there's a disparate bunch of counterparties there. We might have broker relationships, we might have wealth management relationships, we might have direct asset management relationships, or consultants, or professional services and things like that. It's around sort of establishing a structure, an ecosystem of those counterparties, And a lot of the time that can be done via, just writing it all down. So this is sometimes the first time we draw a mud map, really, which is, this is the current situation. This is where, if you think about it from a hierarchical component, which is, this is the family office, and these are all the counterparties, and these are all the moving parts associated with it. These are the reporting lines. These are, we've got the finance department from the operating business that we're using for this. We've got operating, payments, receivables, and things like that from here. We've all these sorts of things. So really what it is about mapping that out, getting, it doesn't have to be pretty, just open, I don't know, PowerPoint or Word, I use PowerPoint generally, just create those little shapes and create a box and drag it and say, this is this part, okay, this is our operating infrastructure, this is our investment counterparties, just write it all down, put it into a big mud map. And obviously, not obviously, but often what you do, that's the first time this is happening, you go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of moving parts here. Who's managing this? Who's managing this relationship? All that kind of stuff. So I really enjoy doing that. I reckon this is one of the first times that's happened, but also what it does is it sort of creates this baseline of saying, okay, well, this is where we're at. Where do we want to be? And sometimes that is establishing structure. We use RFPs and similar, which is we can select wealth managers associated with a criteria. So once you've made that mud map, you go, well, we don't have someone that looks after all these components. We have 4 or 5 counterparties. What's a more efficient way of doing it? Can we get one counterparty to manage all those components? You talk about the RFP process. We do it for wealth managers, asset managers, software providers, operational, intermediaries that do both the operational pieces and the investments. When I say, wealth manager, we include private banks, private wealth, consultants in that, asset managers, software providers, something, the things that are specific to this office. So that's what we do. So that's what happens when we come into these embedded offices. And these embedded offices are incredibly dynamic. They're super fun and interesting because these are the things that people are interested in. They're interested enough to take away their real deep concentration, which is often the operating business. So you know that these things are either fun, interesting, or important, right? So I really like working with this type of client because I can be helpful relatively straight away. So for those asking, so why should we do this, right? So it's fine. It's sort of plodding along. There's no real, we'll get to it at some points. But why should you do it now? So one of the main reasons is this is pre-liquidity event often, right? So when you do have that liquidity event or that sale of the business or massive increase in cash flows, whatever that looks like, having an infrastructure in place that can take those cash flows and implement it efficiently because you've already got the structure in is so helpful. Also, things like having good operating infrastructure, like, the reporting, exactly where everything is. So, and also, if you have a liquidity event and you want to hire staff into this newly formed single family office, having all this in place can save you years of heartache of trying to find people to work within this structure because it's difficult, because they don't know what they're managing, or it creates a really good environment for people that sit in the operating business and they're really happy to move over sometimes with the liquidity event to what is now another business, which is the family office, because they know the underlying constituents are in place. They understand how it works. It's not a challenge to run it. So, pre and post liquidity event, I think it's really super helpful to have this in place. Also, you need clarity on purpose, risk, and expectations. Sure, it's plodding along. Sure, it's fine doing this. But you could potentially miss out on opportunities because, if you're actively seeking gaps in portfolios and things like that, or your wealth managers are not offering you, or your counterparties are not offering you good ideation and insights and potential deal flow because they don't know what you're after, because you haven't made that clear. And making it clear, the first thing to do is to have this improved environment. So I think from an opportunity point of view and from just having that clarity for not only the office itself, but also for the counterparty is super helpful. Also, it can be a really good diversifier against the main asset class. I see this all the time, which is, let's give a real estate operating business, often in the embedded office within the operating business, it looks relatively similar. And it makes sense, right? Because that's where their skills and biases is, and that's where they get their deal flow. So if they're putting things that don't fit in the operating business into the embedded office and it looks very similar, you're not really getting much diversification there. So if you go, no, we're going to make this a proper multi-asset, from a correlated asset class perspective, uncorrelated asset class, correlated asset class perspective, we need to fill this with like a proper portfolio. It will create some good diversification, hopefully, against the actual main operating business. So it may smooth out some components of that cycle. So I think that can be super helpful too. Plus, it spits out distributions and things like that, potentially depending on how you've made structured the portfolio. But again, it can create this diversification of income and total return. And lastly, why should you do this? Because to be perfectly honest, in my experience, this is often the highest risk portfolio. There's risk here. There's there's lack of controls, which increases incidence of insider fraud, inclusion of high-risk counterparties and things like that, because there's no one there making sure that counterparty is doing their job via benchmarking or, some sort of review process. It tends to be the highest risk. And it's not always the highest risk because not everyone's the same. But if you don't give it the appropriate concentration and put in the effort to build this as a proper portfolio or family office services, I mean, not just talking about the investment office here, we're talking about the suite of family office services. You can run into some real big challenges around risk. IT, security, data, personnel, all those things. So that's why it's important, if nothing else, to create a safer environment. So hopefully that was interesting. I love talking about embedded offices. They're usually a really interesting client to have. And like I said, it's the sweet spot for Hall Road because often the governance structure is the challenge. So hopefully that was helpful. On the roundup this week, so I had a really interesting conversation with a local, the head of finance department at a local university here. And the reason why it was interesting is because, the reason I reached out was because I'm starting to see the universities, in particular in the US, start to build out initiatives around family offices. So with that in mind, there's a recent article noting that the Chicago Booth School of Business has launched what they're calling the Booth Family Office Initiative, which BFOI. And that it's not a great acronym, but we'll work with it. And really what it is a what they're calling a combination. So research programs, courses and summits aimed at current and future family office executives, which I think is super cool and really, really worthwhile doing. Obviously, Booth is more famous for behavioural economics programs, so I think that kind of aligns nicely with helping family office professionals navigate sort of the unique part of family office, which is often those interpersonal relationships with families and the decision-making process. So I think that's really helpful. The other thing that was brought up in the article, and obviously I'll link it into the show notes, which is the universities can offer an increasingly rare experience for family office professionals, which is what they're calling the non-commercial gathering, which speaks to me because it's really difficult to get family offices together where there's not some version of selling there, right? So what they're saying is that Wharton, I think, is the one that has the big one, which is, I think they call it the Family Office Roundtable Forum. And it's a collaboration between the school and the actual families. And according to this article anyway, it's become one of the most coveted events of the year for family offices, and they limit it to 60 or 70 invitations. So, and the idea is that it's just about education, information, investment, all these sorts of cool stuff without the idea that someone is selling me something. And that's increasingly difficult to get. And something that I've been thinking about, which is what would that look like at the universities that I talk to? Would that be a good place to have an ability for the universities to impart really good research and information to family offices without saying, oh, and here's how you invest, or this is how we get paid or whatever. So I think that's very interesting. I'm hopeful that the Australian and European and Asian university systems follow the US, because I think it's really interesting. If you've got any information on that, please reach out to me. I'm super interested in it. I'm all about getting more information via those credible sources like the good university system. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Hopefully it was interest. If it was, make sure you set the alert on the podcast and rate it if you can. It always helps. If you are looking for me, you can find me on LinkedIn at Shaun Parkin, and feel free to email me if you find this interesting or you want to talk about if you're a family office and you're saying, well, Shaun, this is and I just talked about myself in the third person. But anyway, if you think it's interesting, this topic, and you want to talk more about it, then email me, Shaun, so SHAUN at hallroad, HALLROAD.com.au, or you find me at hallroad.com.au. And I look forward to the next episode. Thanks very much.